Hi guys, we're back. Chris Fonsi and Greg Ruiz here to talk about hypermedia controls. This is the REST dissertation, Fielding's dissertation, that is probably the most contentious, if you will. As we talked about before, there's a lot of discussion around hypermedia and exactly how to do it, what makes good hypermedia, whether it's needed at all, and so on.
You're gonna give us the right way, right? The definitive.
I'm going to give you a perspective.
The definitive
right?
perspective.
I'm going to give you a perspective. We're actually going to talk about kind of the core concepts of hypermedia. We'll talk through a few examples, just so you can kind of see, what some of the differences are in different hypermedia approaches. And we'll actually talk just a little bit about situations in which hypermedia may or may not be appropriate.
Now, when you say hypermedia, my brain hears hyperlink, right? So that web brain of mine kicks in. But then I think, wait, media so I'm a bit confused. We're not talking about real media, right? We're not talking about images and things. We're talking about relations.
Well, we actually are kind of talking about media in some ways. I mean, again, if you think about API design as revolving around retrieval and updates and so on resources, right? Those resources are media.
Okay.
They have media types and so on. We're not necessarily talking about those things in the context of this particular conversation, but all of those things are media of some sort, right?
Okay.
And you're correct in saying that hypermedia fundamentally deals with retrieving those representations of data by way of links. Right. The $64,000 question is, what is the correct way, if you will, to represent those links, and what kinds of information do people need in order to use hypermedia effectively?
So we're also talking about the sort of almost like a state management. Is it not?
That's pretty much exactly what it is, actually. The whole idea behind hypermedia is that you'll be able to use links that are embedded in the resources that you retrieve or in the metadata that's associated with those resources to figure out what possible state transitions you can make from where you are right now, the current representation of a resource that you're looking at, to any of the possible other representations or other states that resource could have.
But now, when we were talking before we started to record this, we were sort of having a little discussion about this, and I mentioned the idea of a shopping cart. And I said, okay, so I get it. I can be taking a look at a typical shopping cart. I put a product in, and I move from move toward that checkout process, and I have to fill out some information, and then I move another step in the transactions with that shopping cart, and then suddenly I want to go backwards. That to me is a state change, but you had a different perspective on that.
Well, I think the general perspective that I would suggest is that you can look at the transitions among different states of the shopping cart as being a form of hypermedia in a way. I think the challenge you run into with hypermedia, and we'll talk a little bit about this as we get through this section, is that the hyperlink, if you will, and the link relation, which we'll talk about in a second, actually kind of represent only a part of the state transition. So for example, if you are posting a new item to a shopping cart, right? That item has a representation. The representation is not actually described as part of hypermedia.
Right.
And yet the fact that you actually can potentially post a representation to add an item to a cart could potentially be included in this. Okay. And so the link itself and the link relation, which describes the actions that you can possibly take, are definitely part of hypermedia, but there's still kind of an open question around exactly what types of additional information you might need to provide in order to make that transition from one state representation to the next.
Well, so I think I get it, but I think we should look at maybe a real world example. I mean, do you have some code from some real world examples?
Right? I do have some code. Yeah, but let's actually talk for a second about kind of the core concepts of hypermedia. And we've kind of talked a little bit about this already. There's the concept of a link, which is something that you can follow very much in the spirit of HTML links or HTTP links, that allows you to move from one state transition to the next. Okay. The other one is this concept of relations, which actually give meaning to the link. And so an automated system can look at the relation, and they have some sense as to what the link actually represents.
Okay.
So for example, let's take a look at something that Netflix has actually done as part of their API. They've implemented links. They've given a very clear link to a specific resource, which represents potentially another state in this particular transition, or another item in a collection, or something along that line, right? Depending on what operation they're doing. They've provided a link relation, which in this particular case is it's a reference to another entity type. And so this has some specific meaning to the applications that use the Netflix API. And they were kind enough to provide a title along this that in this particular case just says that maybe we're iterating through Elijah Wood movies, for example, right? Another one is the GitHub API, which actually provides a URL. It gives a type of organization and gives you some additional information that allows you to use this particular link.
Okay.
So you can see that these are two definitely distinct and different approaches. One of them uses an approach that is more consistent with the web linking specification, which is an RFC that's already out there, and that would be the Netflix API. The other one is based a little bit more on a JSON structure, less consistent with web linking, but still it has a lot of good information, and applications that use things could probably figure out how to use it. Right?
Got it.
So what we generally recommend is that you follow the web linking specification, RFC 5988, and it actually defines links that are very similar to what Netflix has used. I would say the big difference in this particular example that we're showing here is the fact that we're using these relations in a way that's slightly different from what Netflix had done. The RFC actually has a definition of standard link relations, and previous, next, and current are actually examples of those.
Okay.
And so if an application follows a standard, they can look at these relations and they immediately know what the meaning is.
Right.
Whereas if you look at something like what Netflix has done, the meaning of the link is lost. Not intuitively obvious.
Right. Exactly.
But the specification also provides for this concept of an extension relation type, and that's essentially what Netflix has done here. They've decided that the standard set of relations doesn't necessarily match their particular need for the application at hand, and so they've defined a set of extension relation types which better suit their particular need.
Got it.
Obviously, with some sort of sample code and documentation and potentially a little bit of developer guidance, these things are eminently consumable. Right? They just don't necessarily have intuitive meaning to somebody who doesn't already work with the Netflix API.
Right. Now, I remember, when we were talking about this early on in one of the earlier segments, there was a slide I think we put up on screen with 6 different interpretations, shall we call it, of this idea of hypermedia. You want to take us through each of those, sort of break it down for us?
I'll actually take you through a few different samples, some of which come specifically from those and some of which don't. So for example, if we take a look at Atom, for example, Atom actually does have the link relations, the very last child item before the end of the entry element. And they actually use the standardized link relations that come from the RFC. And so an application that looks at this can say, well, here's a link. It pops me into edit mode because I understand very clearly what edit means as a link relation.
Absolutely.
And so I can follow this link and I'm immediately taken to edit mode. So it's really pretty straightforward.
Got it.
You look at something like XHTML, which doesn't really have a concept of hypermedia, if you will. I mean, obviously it has links in it, but the relations aren't necessarily intuitively obvious. I suppose you could probably make something like this conform to the web linking standard. More often than not, though, you really don't see that kind of thing in XHTML documents because they're meant primarily for conveying relatively static content, and not necessarily content that's related to API type entities.
Right.
If you look at HAL, which is one of the standards that was in that list that you mentioned, this now does in fact use link relations, self, next, and previous, and it has relative hrefs that allow you to kind of go to the previous or next page, for example.
Sort of a real paging implementation. Yeah. So I've got 100 products and I only want to show 10 at a time and want to page through those.
Well, this actually would allow you to iterate through one item at a time. So if you're, this is analogous to using an iterator to go through a Java collection, for example. Yeah. Okay, so you're retrieving one item at a time. You can play with it, look at it, do some stuff with it, and then go off and go to the next one, right? The interesting thing about this one, though, is that it doesn't actually provide the full link. It just provides a relative link. And so the application has to have enough smarts to be able to say, well, this is associated with a particular domain name. Maybe there was a particular path segment, for example, that needs to go onto the front of this. So the application has to have a little bit of smarts, but this is still a pretty consumable way of approaching hypermedia.
Yep.
Collection JSON takes a slightly different approach. They actually have links. They don't actually provide so much in the way of relations, although
Right.
down here in queries you can see, for example, that they have relation search, and they give you, again, a dot relative path name.
Right.
So you have a similar problem in this particular case in that it doesn't give you the full domain name. You can't just
Right.
click on the domain or click on the link and off you go.
Right.
You have to have some smarts around it.
Got it.
And this kind of implies that all of these links that we're following are all in the same general domain. Whereas if we provided the domain name and any preceding path nodes or anything, those domains could actually be anywhere
Correct.
in the big bright internet. Siren, very similar. In this particular case, though, they actually did provide the full path, and so now the application doesn't have to have any sense of where it is.
Correct.
They don't have to try and build the actual link using a partial path from the payload combined with other information. They can just say, here's my path, and I'm going to follow this link. We're using the standard link relation types, and so it's actually super straightforward as to what these links represent.
Got it. So basically, what you're saying is now that we've understood hypermedia, we've understood all the things that have gone before. We've actually, I think, if I recall that maturity model, we're in nirvana now, right?
Well, kind of. We kind of are. It's
Wait, you can't kind of be in nirvana.
well, you can in this session. Because we said that the Richardson maturity model is being used in this particular context as a way of thinking about the good things in REST. Okay, so basically what we've done is go through the general concept of resources. We've talked about HTTP verbs. Now we've talked about hypermedia. These are all the things that really make REST in the purest sense very powerful, right? And there's lots of different things you can do with all of these particular concepts, and there's tons of applications you could build. You could foster lots of innovation by doing this, right? But I think the perspective we take is that this is not necessarily the be-all, do-all, end-all of APIs. There's a lot of additional things that you need to know about, things you can do with APIs, standards you should probably think about that will make your API even more consumable, even going beyond some of the things that are talked about in Fielding's dissertation.
Okay.
Right? So we'll actually go through a few more of those things in our next session, so stay tuned.